Now on BBC News, it's Talking Business.
Hello and welcome to Talking Business. Here's what's on the programme this week. The soaring cost of climate change as world leaders meet in Azerbaijan. They talk about spending trillions of dollars, but who is going to pay the bill? Now, tackling climate change and switching to green energy will cost the world's poorest countries huge sums. But can it also help transform the global economy? I'll discuss who'll pay the bill and where the money is coming from with these two. One of the leading experts behind that UN-backed report that puts the cost at $2.4 trillion a year and why it's likely to mean we'll all pay more in tax. And what role do businesses play? This man works with Amazon, Chevron, Danone and Volkswagen and tells me how business can do its bit to keep bills down and drive the change we need. Plus, the changing world of work. We hear from the founder of one company trying to help firms hire a worldwide workforce by making global recruitment quicker and easier. Welcome to the programme. Now, climate change is threatening the basis of our economic survival. That is the stark warning from the head of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde. And it underlines the huge significance of the COP29 global climate talks. They've been underway in Azerbaijan this week. Now, they've been dubbed the Finance COP because so much of the discussion has been about how to meet the massive costs of climate change. Now, the whole point of these talks is to try to limit average global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. It's likely to be breached, though, this year for the first time.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
It was part of a deal agreed in Paris in 2015, which also said that rich countries that benefited from industrialisation but also warmed the planet will help less well-off countries meet the costs of adapting to climate change and switching to renewable energy. But it is expensive. The bill, which excludes China, is estimated at $2.4 trillion a year by the year 2030. That's according to a top group of experts appointed by the United Nations. That's nearly 2% of the entire global economy and would pay for things like investing in renewable energy, adaptation and other climate-related issues. The figure is more than 20 times as much as the $115 billion that rich countries actually stumped up in 2022. But critics say much of the funding isn't new, it's simply been repackaged from other purposes. And so with that in mind, here's what some of the leaders at the talks have been saying.
This crisis is affecting every single individual in the world, one way or another. And I am as frustrated as anyone that one single COP can't deliver the full transformation that every nation needs.
Temperatures are only part of the picture. The incredible amount of rain in Spain was a wake-up call. How much more water a warmer atmosphere can hold?
The fires that devour your forests, the hurricanes that shatter our homes, are not distant misfortunes, but shared tragedies. What we endure, you endure. What we lose, you lose. And if we fail to act, it will be our children and grandchildren who bear the burden.
We must continue advancing the green transition while also maintaining our use of natural gas, oil and nuclear energy. The price of climate change should not be paid by our farmers. Farmers are the backbone of our economy and society.
It is the lack of finance that inhibits our ambitions, which is why this COP, the finance COP, we need to deliver. The new climate finance goal must reflect the true scale of the climate crisis. The need is in trillions, not billions.
We are participating with the financing of $31 billion out of the $100 billion pledge. That is more than a fair share for the European Union, and we are calling on everyone to follow our example, including the G7 and emerging countries. We stress the need to broaden the donor base.
And so those are some of the thoughts of world leaders gathered in Baku. But the big question is where all the money will come from to help tackle climate change. I've been speaking to one of the co-chairs of the UN-appointed independent high-level expert group on climate finance. He's trying to guide the world in the right direction. Vera Songwe, welcome to the programme. Now talk to me about that number, that $2.4 trillion that's going to be needed to tackle climate change every year by 2030. How do you come up with that number?
For a very long time, there had been the conversation around, the 100 billion. But the 100 billion was a number that, during the Paris conference, we just talked about, but there was no deductive analysis of how do you build up to the number. How we came up with the 2.4 trillion, we decided to look at each of the different items around the transition and what was needed for the transition. And so how did we get to it? If you think about the just transition needs about $75 billion. If you think about nature and capital and sustainable agriculture, we need about $300 billion to do it. If you think about coping with loss and damage, we need about somewhere in the order of $250 billion to be able to address loss and damage annually, each of those numbers. Adaptation and resilience finance, $250 billion. And the energy transition, which is the biggest, as we all know, about $1.5 billion. If you add those numbers together, it gives you somewhere in the order of $2.4 trillion that is needed for the climate transition.
So it's helpful that there is now a number. We know perhaps what we're aiming for. The question, though, is who will pay for it? Who will pick up the bill?
So we're hoping that to meet this bill, we have a composition. Of course, it needs a global partnership. We're fighting a common global problem. Countries themselves, domestic resource mobilization, they're going to have to deliver 1.4 trillion of those resources. The other trillion we're arguing should come from the multilateral development banks, which are essentially the global institutions that have been put to finance and support countries' development, our partner countries, our G7 advanced economy partner countries, and then the private sector. If these global institutions like the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank can triple the amount of resources from 120 billion to 390 billion, more or less, of spending with extra concessional spending for the poorest, then we are expecting and hoping that the private sector can use some of this concessional cheap money, which is coming from these institutions, which essentially they can get at lower than market price, to blend and close their gaps of financing to be able to then sort of also come in to invest in these countries.
Should it always fall on richer nations to pick up a large proportion of that bill?
Today, over 80% of the global greenhouse gas emissions that we find in the atmosphere are caused by the top 20 G20 countries. So the 20 most polluting countries, or 80% of the pollution comes from the 20 G20 countries. Of course, within them are the G7 countries. We need leadership from them, for they themselves to pay for their own cleaning of the environment. We have the 2.4 trillion number as the number for the emerging markets and the developing economies, but we do have a much larger number, which is a 5.3 trillion to $6.7 trillion number, where the advanced economies themselves will pay for their own cleanup in the order of about $2.7 trillion, and they have the resources to do that. But we also need for them, given that they are also the source of a lot of the pollution, to be able to contribute into the multilateral development system, into a global commons bucket, so that they can help contribute and help middle-income countries and low-income countries. Of course, some middle-income countries are themselves also polluters.
Are you hopeful that the money can be raised? Because if you look at the latest figures from the OECD, they say $115 billion was spent on this challenge. That was in 2022. That is a huge shortfall from the number you're talking about.
That is very true. I think you touched on a very important point. Africa, for example, is only getting 5% of what it needs, $1.6 billion of what it needs, essentially, for the climate transition last year. And so there is a huge, huge effort. The finance gap, the United Nations Environment Agency just came up with numbers about sort of what is the financing gap. It is quite huge. Of course, there's domestic resource mobilization, but capital increase of the multilateral development system, which is essentially advanced economies, putting in more paid-in capital into these institutions to help them be able to contribute and help support developing middle-income countries and low-income countries do this is important. Building a carbon markets, which will then allow for the private sector. Many of the private sector companies, if you take, for example, the shipping company, have all pledged to go to net zero. but they are hard to abate sectors, which means they cannot transition very quickly. So there are different buckets where we can raise resources to be able to meet the funding gap that is required. But it needs political will and it needs leadership. Those taxes, when collected, need to be spent efficiently and in the right sectors to help enable the transition. It is very difficult to tell, to predict the future or to say, if you don't do 2.4 trillion today, then what you're going to need to do tomorrow is 5 trillion because it's going to become even more expensive.
But governments are conflicted, aren't they? On one hand, they say that they're committed to tackling climate change. They want to facilitate that green transition. But at the same time, they're still subsidising things like fossil fuels. How can they make that work?
I think it's also the fossil fuel subsidy today is about $7 trillion globally, both production subsidies and consumption subsidies. It is important for us to realize that, these subsidies one needs to phase out carefully, because if they're not done well, then sometimes it is the poorest that pay the highest price. And we've seen many African countries, from Ethiopia to Senegal to Nigeria, trying to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Some people will still need a subsidy, but we don't want, of course, to be subsidizing kerosene fuel for private jets. We need to make sure that we phase it out efficiently. I think the last thing that we need is to have energy shortages, which then will, increase prices and make it very difficult for us to actually do orderly transition.
When you talk about the scale of this challenge, it's clear that there need to be some tough decisions. Governments are going to have to choose what they can afford to spend on and what they can't. Inevitably, taxes are going to have to go up to pay for this, aren't they?
Taxes will have to go up. Domestic resource mobilization, $1.4 trillion. We're going to have to make sure that in many of the developing countries, in Africa in particular, tax revenue to GDP on average is 17%. In Europe, it's 34%. We cannot expect the developed world to continue closing that gap for the emerging markets. But we need, one, if you give better technology to the developing countries, they can then grow their manufacturing sector. We're talking about an environment where we have over 6,000 trade restrictions in the global economy. We need to lift them so that trade actually happens in a more fluid way and generates jobs, creates the kinds of incomes that would raise the taxes that are needed for some of these transitions to happen. So it really is a system-wide conversation that we need to have.
But right now, given the cost of living crisis, it is unpalatable for governments to raise taxes anymore. The cost of borrowing is at high levels for many countries. How can governments afford to pay for this?
I think what many people are seeing is we've all watched Barcelona, we've all watched Valencia, we saw North Carolina, we saw Florida. We're looking at the Horn of Africa with droughts and floods. And we're seeing the cost of not addressing the climate challenge. It's about $9 billion for the recent floods in the United States. Similar amounts in Europe are coming. So there is going to be, if we don't spend the money in anticipation to make sure that we can protect our planet, we're going to have to spend it to recover from the disaster. So I think it's a choice that needs to be made. And we're talking about, when we say $2.4 trillion, global GDP today is somewhere in the order of $111 trillion. There's a lot of resources that can go around. It has to be efficient. Access to those finances needs to be cheaper, and the use of it has to be efficient for it to be able to deliver the kind of cost of living expectations that countries want.
When it comes to COP, a former UN Secretary General and a former UN climate chief, they've said that it is simply no longer fit for purpose. Is a COP event where you set targets, you do a lot of talking and you set some pretty ambitious aims, are they really fit for purpose? Do they still work?
I think the COP process is an important process because if you look at what happened coming out of Egypt, for example, with the emphasis on the loss and damage fund, the UAE consensus, the financing framework that was put together coming out of UAE, the 10-point agenda is actually being implemented. So I think the COP has succeeded in making it a global discussion. There is certainly more that can be done to make it more efficient and clearly to raise and close this financing gap as fast as we can.
Vera Songwe, thank you for being on the programme with us this week.
Thank you very much for having me at the BBC. Thank you.
So that's the scale of the challenge. But what role does business play in all of this? They, of course, have profited from globalisation. Are they doing enough to limit the impact that they have on the environment? Well, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is made up of more than 200 businesses. Household names like Amazon, Chevron, IKEA, Meta, McDonald's, Nestle and Toyota. I've been speaking to its chief executive. Peter Backer, welcome to the programme. It's good to have you with us. And talk to me first of all, if you will, about whether you think private companies, the private sector, is doing enough when it comes to the challenge of climate change. We talk about big numbers about what needs to be done, about who is going to pay for it. Is the private sector stepping up?
Well, I think the number of companies that have now set net zero goals and are beginning to drive that into transformation is growing rapidly. But obviously, collectively, business is not doing enough because the emissions in the world are still going up.
What role would you want private sector companies to play? What is their responsibility here?
Well, I think the private sector companies have the main responsibility to drive innovation. You know, we need to rethink everything, the way we produce food, the buildings we use, the type of transport solutions we offer to customers. And that means massive innovation, electrification of vehicles, cleaner buildings, regenerative agriculture. And all of that will have to be driven by companies through their innovation agenda.
Who is going to pay for that, though? Because that requires a significant capital investment on the part of those companies at a time when they can't really raise prices for consumers. Borrowing is more expensive than it's been in a long time. How are they going to fund that transition?
Yeah, companies have begun to really now invest into these solutions. If you look at the more advanced car companies, they used to, up to now, invest all their capital into making more efficient combustion engines. And you've seen those capex decisions now completely move to battery electric solutions. So it's not like a light switch and on and off change, but over time you will see those products come to market. Some of these products initially are more expensive for customers. So that's where subsidies and other support from governments will be necessary. But what you then see, and electric vehicles is a great example of that, the more of those vehicles are being produced, the faster the unit costs come down and the more affordable they become for consumers to buy them.
How much stability and certainty is needed on the part of government when it comes to setting targets or an agenda that private companies can follow? Because it strikes me there is a lot of political cyclical decision making whereby something that is announced one minute is cancelled the next. And what business wants to see clearly is that if they are investing this sort of money in this sort of transition, that there will be certainty in that decision making. Is there enough of that?
Well, it's clearly the case that the world is no longer an easy place to operate in. You know, the various political elections that hop from left to right, the geopolitical tensions in the world, is still ongoing economic uncertainty. I think generally speaking, you can say that business wants a stable political environment. But on the climate issue, I would argue there's more needed than that. You know, the risks that climate now poses to the world, but also to the supply chain of business, are such that business has a case to invest now. But also as these transitions kick in, you now begin to see that if companies do not invest, they fall behind and their competitiveness is at stake. So yes, stable policy helps, but there's a real business case now for companies to go at it alone as well.
What is the overriding driver of private sector involvement in tackling climate change? Is it purely self-preservation? It's about protecting their own interest. Is it about that there is actually an economic and financial opportunity in being greener? Or is it incentives from government saying if you don't behave, you'll either face penalties or you will not get the incentives that we're currently offering?
Now, I think the case is more and more one of future competitiveness of your business. We come out of an era where first it was about CSR, about being a responsible citizen as a company. Then it was about let's set a really ambitious target and show the world that we're more ambitious than others. But those eras are now kind of behind us. It is really two drivers. One is the risk that climate change poses. And this is not just an abstract risk, but supply chains of companies are being disrupted by the floods, the droughts, the fires, and that needs to be managed well by companies. But the second, and that's always the more exciting one, as we move into new solutions, new vehicles bringing to the market, new ways of building buildings, new energies that are being deployed. The companies that are most successful and first to market in bringing those solutions will really be winning and from that point of view, reap the economic benefits.
Are private sector companies ambitious enough? I'm looking at a report here. It's from Climate Impact Partners, saying 45% of the world's 500 biggest companies plan to be net zero in their carbon emissions by 2050. What is holding them back? Why is it taking that long? And should they be more ambitious?
Yeah, I think, if you know the size of, for instance, the energy system, if you know the amount of vehicles that are on the road, and the time that those vehicles will be on the road because people have bought them with their own money, then it is a slow process to change. I mean, these transitions aren't rapid. Can we go faster? Absolutely. Do we need to go faster? Absolutely too. But I don't think the debate is so interesting whether it's 2050 or 2040. The real debate is, can we go faster towards 2030? Because that will create a trajectory, a path to a much faster decarbonization later on.
Peter Bacher, thank you for being on the programme with us this week.
Thank you very much.
Now, millions of people around the world are these days earning a living without even stepping out of their own homes. The switch to remote working means they've got more opportunities than ever to pick and choose from companies to work for. And for the companies themselves, they've got a bigger talent pool than ever before to find the staff that they need. All of that is good news for GP. It stands for Globalisation Partners. It's a firm that takes care of taxes, accounting and other admin that should make it easier for businesses to hire across borders. I've been speaking to its founder and chief executive. Nicole Sahin, welcome to the programme. Now, tell me what you do and how it is that you're helping businesses break down borders when it comes to their recruitment.
What we do is we help companies expand all over the world without them having to set up or navigate legal HR and tax issues. What that means is anytime a company wants to hire an employee in another country, traditionally they have to register for payroll in that country, usually set up a company in that country. And there's a lot of administrative and HR and legal and tax issues associated with hiring somebody in another country. Instead of a company having to do all of that, we put their employee on our payroll in that country. They pay our company in one of our US companies typically. They pay us, we pay the employee, and it keeps our customers out of the tax and legal jurisdiction of doing business in another country. And we've also built software on top. So essentially, it's very quick and seamless for customers to do this from anywhere.
And I guess that raises the issue, doesn't it, of not just being able to work anywhere in the world. It means that there is competition globally for those jobs. So you're not just competing with someone in your local area, you're competing with people all over the world.
Yeah, I would say that's true. So it's actually good in many ways, because with the increase of remote working, what we've really seen is the rise of the rest. And it's not that people are competing for the lowest salaries, it's the democratization of opportunity globally. So the best person for the job very well might be in the United States, in Europe, in Singapore, in the countries where these headquarters companies were traditionally consolidated. But that best person for the job might also be in Brazil or India or China. And really, companies are going wherever the talent is. But what we're seeing is that they're not trying to reduce the pay of their workers in these other countries. In fact, the salaries of these employees around the globe are increasing very rapidly, because what companies want is talent. I mean, unemployment rates in the United States, it's just historical lows by any precedence for just the longest period of time. Companies just don't have the talent that they need. And that's why they need to go internationally in order to be able to run their businesses.
But there must be an element here where a boss can sit there and say, I can hire anyone anywhere in the world. And so I don't need to worry about where they're located. They don't need to be in my factory or my workshop. I can get people for a bit cheaper, can't they?
Yes. And I would say that was the driver more frequently. Even 5 years ago, we were seeing that more. But now that, there's been a long enough time since the pandemic and kind of the era prior to that. So for example, customer service jobs were often in the United States, often outsourced to Mexico, for example, because it was a lot lower in cost. And there's a huge amount of English speakers in Mexico. But what we've seen is that the salaries in Mexico have increased so much in the last few years that companies no longer want to do that unless it's really, truly the right place for them to hire the talent. Now they more often would rather kind of nearshore is what it's called, hire people in the US who have the same linguistic and cultural knowledge as where their customers are based. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying it a lot less than it was.
And culture is a really important issue, isn't it? You might be able to hire people from all over the world, but how do you make sure that people are a right fit for an organisation? They might have very different values, different sorts of cultural norms within different countries. How do you make sure the people you're putting in businesses are the right people, not just for the skills, but culturally a good fit too?
Yeah, I completely empathize with that because at GP, we have employees in over 60 countries in-house. It might be up to 70 right now. And I remember when I first started hiring internationally, even though I spent my entire career doing this and building a company that made this possible, I was nervous too because I loved the culture of my company. And as soon as you take the leap and start hiring somebody, we needed people in Europe, for example, to handle our European market. And they know the market better and they can become just as passionate about the business as you can. And then I think there's this exchange of ideas and information and inspiration and that humanness of us. There's something a little different about people from each country, but honoring what makes us special, it just makes it more fun. Statistics say that young people want to work for global organizations, and it's because of that potential, it's because of the opportunity, and it's because of the excitement.
Nicole Sahin, Chief Executive of GP, it's good to have you on the programme this week. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks. Nice to speak with you, Ben.
That's all from us this week. For the latest business, check out the BBC News website and app. We'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Hello there. Well, Storm Bert has given us some very severe weather conditions right across the UK through the day on Saturday. Heavy snow, rain,